In section 9, we're going to look at inverse trig functions. So we'll find values of inverse trig functions, and then we'll solve some equations that deal with these inverse trig functions as well. The hardest part of this lesson is just understanding the restrictions of the domain for inverse trig functions. And then the examples are usually pretty easy out of this. So off to the right here, I'm going to deal with this in terms of a picture. This would be what your inverse would look like. Remember, to find an inverse of any function, we flip the location of x and y. So if I give you an equation of a line, y equals 5x plus 2, for example, to find its inverse, we flip the location of x and y. So we went x equals 5y plus 2, and then we resolved for y. That's really what you're doing here. Notice what they do. Instead of saying y equals sine of x, they now have x equals sine of y. So they just flip the location of x and y. And when they do that, this is the graph that they get. The only problem with this graph is that this is not a function. Remember, in order to be a function, it has to pass the vertical line test. And if I'm hitting the graph in more than one location, it's not a function. So what they do is they restrict the domain quite a bit of times so that we come up with a function. In this case, we're going to restrict the domain to be between -1 and 1 for the inverse sine. And they do the same thing for inverse cosine down here as well. You're going to be restricted between -1 and 1. For tangent, there is no restriction. You can plug in any values and still be good. Okay, so some examples. So what this is going to look like. For inverse cosine, it wants us to find each value, and it wants us to write angle measures in degrees and radians. So for this, you should be able to take out your calculator, plug this straight in, and it should get you a degree. So if you type in inverse cosine of -1/2, it should get you the value. Just make sure that you're in degree mode when you do this. So inverse cosine of -1/2 gets us a degree of 120. If I want to change that to radians, remember, to change to radians, you just take 120 and multiply it by pi over 180, which would get you 120 pi over 180. And we can simplify that to 2 pi over 3. So you are at 120 degrees, or 2 pi over 3. The letter B, don't let them confuse you with arctan. Arctan is really just the same thing as the inverse tangent of 1. So if you plug that in, you would get 45 degrees. And then to change to radians, you would get this, which would be 45 pi over 180, which comes out to pi over 4.